The first thing you should know is that this wasn't found in a journal. It wasn't tucked into a drawer, or buried in a duffel bag, or mailed to a newsroom in a brown envelope with no return address. It was filed, cataloged, stamped. The kind of record that's supposed to sit quietly in a government archive until the paper yellows and the ink fades and nobody remembers what it was about. Except, this one didn't fade. This one kept updating. If you're watching right now, keep your eyes on the screen for one reason. Near the end of this story, there is a line in the final recording that should not exist. A line that appears after the ranger is officially listed as missing. And the only reason I can say that out loud is because somebody made a mistake and let it slip through. Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. If you like slow burn horror that feels like a recovered confession, hit subscribe right now, because this channel is where the stories don't end cleanly. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your city, your country, wherever you are right now. I read those. I really do. Because this story begins in a place where the nearest town might as well be a rumor. It begins in Alaska's Denali region, where distance is measured in hours of white, and the weather can erase evidence the way a hand wipes dust from a table. And it begins with a federal ranger who didn't believe in myths. He believed in protocols. He believed in checklists, GPS coordinates, weather readings, wildlife reports, trail conditions. The kind of work that keeps you calm because it always has an answer. Until one day, it didn't. Until his recordings started contradicting his own memory. Until the timestamps began to drift and the language of his logs began to change. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, like a voice learning to imitate him. His name doesn't matter. Not because he wasn't real. Not real. Real. Not real. But because after what happened, the name became a placeholder. A blank. A file number. The kind of detail you don't include when you're trying to make a person disappear without making it look like you tried. What matters is that he worked for the federal government. Not a volunteer. Not a seasonal hire. Not someone who wandered out there chasing adventure with a cheap camera and a romantic idea of wilderness. He was trained. He was assigned. He carried a radio that was supposed to reach any tower within range, and he carried a recorder that was meant to preserve his patrol logs, word for word, day by day. So there could never be confusion about where he was and what he saw. That's the thing about Denali. Confusion is what kills you. Out there, if you walk in the wrong direction for long enough, the land doesn't correct you. The land doesn't warn you. It simply keeps being land. It keeps being snow and rock and wind, until your certainty runs out before the terrain does. That's why rangers record everything. Because memory gets unreliable when the world is nothing but white and silence. And because if you go missing, the first question isn't why. The first question is where. This ranger was assigned to a stretch of the Denali region that most visitors never see. Not the tourist roads, not the postcard overlooks, not the scenic trails with signs and benches and guided groups. He patrolled the places with no names, the places that only exist on internal maps. Glacial flats, tree-lined breaks, valleys that swallow radio signals, ridges where the wind can hit hard enough to make you feel like you're leaning into an invisible wall. His schedule was routine. Multi-day patrol. Check remote equipment. Confirm wildlife patterns. Look for illegal camps. Document anything unusual. And his recordings at first sound like exactly that. Dry, professional. A man talking into a device because it's part of the job. He starts with the basics. Weather. Visibility, wind. He lists coordinates like prayers. He repeats times and locations as if repetition alone can anchor him to reality. Not real. Real. Not real. Then the first mistake appears. It isn't a scream. It isn't a whisper. It isn't a sudden shout of panic. It's something worse. It's a gap. A section of audio where the wind continues, where the recorder continues, but the ranger doesn't speak. At first you'd assume he simply stopped talking. Maybe he was climbing. Maybe he was listening. Maybe he was focused. But the odd part is what happens at the end of that gap. He exhales. And the device picks up another exhale right after it. So close it sounds like it's coming from the same mouth. Except the timing is wrong. Not real. Real. Not real. The file is labeled as a normal patrol log. Same formatting. Same agency template embedded in the metadata. Same digital signature. Nothing looks tampered with. And that's what makes it difficult to dismiss. Because if somebody wanted to fake this, they didn't do it like a person faking a scary story. They did it like someone filling out paperwork. The ranger's next entries are still normal, still grounded, still practical. He mentions a weather station that needs clearing. He mentions animal tracks. He mentions a familiar feeling of the wind shifting at dusk. But then he repeats a phrase. Not once, not twice. Over and over again across multiple logs, sometimes whispered, sometimes stated plainly. Always placed where it doesn't belong. Not real. Real. Not real. It doesn't match his tone. It doesn't match his training. It reads like a private thought that accidentally slipped into an official record. Except, it keeps happening, and then something else begins. The timestamps. His recording device is supposed to lock time from satellites whenever it can, and when it can't, it keeps time internally and resyncs when signal returns. That's standard. So the timestamps shouldn't drift by more than a minute or two. But in these files, they drift in ways that don't make sense. Logs filed on the same day are spaced too far apart. A morning entry appears after an afternoon entry. A night entry appears twice. The same minute appears in 3 separate files, and in each one, the ranger is in a different location. Not real. Real. Not real. The official incident report says the ranger was last confirmed on patrol near a boundary line before a weather system moved in. They mention poor visibility. Sudden snow. Search efforts delayed. Standard language. Clean. Careful. But these recordings don't match that timeline. Because the recordings keep going. For days beyond his last confirmed position, there are logs that speak in his voice, using his codes, his phrasing, his cadence. And the deeper you listen, the more it becomes clear that the voice is trying to hold itself together. Trying to stay professional. Trying to stay human. Trying to remain the man who began the patrol. There's a moment in one of the early files where he says, almost absent-mindedly, that the landscape feels too quiet. Not in a poetic way, in a procedural way. He says it like it's a malfunction. Like he's noting an irregularity in the environment the way you'd note a broken sensor. Then he stops for a second. And he says, very softly, like he's testing the words. Denali doesn't echo, and he repeats it again in the next log. Denali doesn't echo. And again, Denali doesn't echo. Not real. Real. Not real. By the time the recordings were discovered, someone had already tried to bury them in a chain of internal storage. Someone had already attached a classification tag that didn't match the file category. Someone had already moved them into a folder that shouldn't exist in the first place. But the last file was sitting right there. Unhidden. Unprotected. As if the system itself wanted it heard. As if the system believed the ranger was still doing his job. And if you stay with me to the end of this story, you'll hear why that matters. Because the impossible thing wasn't what he saw. The impossible thing was what started speaking back through his own records. Not real. Real. Not real. The first official log in the sequence begins the way they all begin. Timestamp. Weather. Visibility. A steady voice, clipped at the edges the way people sound when they've learned to speak only what matters. He states his identifier, his patrol route designation, and the equipment he's carrying. He notes the battery levels on his recorder, his radio, his GPS unit. He says it all with the kind of calm that makes you trust him before you even know him. There's no drama in it. There's no hint, at first, that anything is wrong. He's out near a stretch of Denali that most people will never step foot on. There are no signs, no marked trails, no scenic pull-offs. This is a corridor of wilderness the agency monitors because it's where people vanish the easiest. It's where weather changes without warning, and where the distance between 2 points on a map can become a small lifetime when the wind turns. He talks about his arrival as if he's reading from a checklist. He mentions the access point where he left the last maintained road behind. The way the engine noise died off and the silence rushed in so fast, it felt like pressure on the ears. He describes unloading supplies, checking his pack straps, resecuring the case holding the recorder. He says the name of the region the way you might say the name of a coworker. Denali. Not with awe. Not with fear. Just a location. Then he pauses. Not long. Just long enough to hear the wind move, and then he says something small that almost doesn't register. He says the snow is wrong. Not dangerous. Not deep. Not drifting. Wrong. He explains it like an occupational detail. The top layer has crusted too quickly. Hard. Glassy. Underneath it is powder, soft enough to swallow a boot to the ankle. It doesn't match the temperature. It doesn't match the recent weather patterns. He says he's seen it before. He says it happens when wind comes down from high ridges and polishes the surface like a hand-smoothing fabric. Then he says, quieter, more to himself than the recorder. Not real. Real. Not real. In the early parts of the files, he doesn't explain that phrase. It appears like a nervous habit, like something he mutters when he's concentrating. And for a while you can pretend that's all it is. He continues on. His pace is steady. He counts his steps sometimes, not out loud, but you can hear the rhythm of his breathing shift as if he's matching it to footfalls. He notes landmarks that aren't landmarks in any tourist sense. A bend in a frozen stream, a line of darker spruce, a boulder split like a broken tooth. He's heading toward a remote monitoring station, a small unit that logs wind speed and temperature, and stores data until someone comes to physically retrieve it. Those stations are placed in areas where the environment can kill the equipment as easily as it can kill a person. He says this one has been inconsistent. He says the last data packet contained a strange gap of several hours where the station recorded nothing at all. Not a sudden drop. Not a malfunction marker. Just blank. He says the station might be iced over. He says he'll clear it and run diagnostics. Routine. He hikes for hours. The recordings pick up long stretches where there's no speech, only the soft scrape of movement and the steady exhale of someone walking in cold air. When he speaks again, he's reached the edge of a tree line, where the spruce thin out and the land opens into a wide basin. He describes the basin carefully. Flat. Open. A gentle slope downward. A place where you can see for miles. He says visibility is excellent. The kind of visibility rangers like because it leaves nowhere for mistakes to hide. Then, he stops again. He doesn't say why he stopped, but the sound changes slightly. Like his boots have settled into a stance. Like he's standing still and listening. He inhales. Exhales. And he says, very calmly, as if he's reading a number from a gauge. There are tracks. He describes them. 2 lines of impressions, evenly spaced, heading across the basin toward the distant rise of a ridge. He notes the depth, the width, the way the edges have hardened. He says they aren't fresh, but they aren't old either. He says they're human. That's not immediately alarming. People do get out there. Hunters sometimes. Illegal campers. Lost hikers who wandered too far off the maintained paths. Occasionally someone runs from something in their life and chooses wilderness because they think it's empty. But then he adds another detail. They're too straight. He explains what that means. Human tracks usually wander. Even when someone is trying to walk straight, the terrain pushes them. The wind pushes them. The land shifts underfoot. People adjust. People hesitate. People stop and turn and look around. These tracks do none of that. They go in an unbroken line, perfectly consistent. And the spacing is wrong. He takes a moment, and you can hear him shift his weight, like he's squinting at the impressions. He says the stride length is too long, not impossible, but wrong. He kneels, and his breath gets louder as the recorder picks it up closer. He runs a gloved hand near the edge of one footprint, careful not to disturb it. Then he says something that changes the temperature of the whole recording. He says there are no return tracks. The line crosses the basin and disappears at the base of the ridge. No turn back, no branching, no continuation he can immediately see. Just a straight line into open snow and then nothing. Not real. Real. Not real. He says he's going to follow them. He says it the same way he'd say he's going to check a weather station. He starts walking. The wind is still steady, but there's another sound now. Faint, intermittent. A light clicking, as if ice crystals are tapping against his gear. It comes and goes. It's hard to tell if it's the environment or something else. He follows the tracks across the basin. As he gets closer to where they vanish, he speaks less. Not because he's scared, at least not yet. Because he's paying attention. The tracks lead directly to the ridgeline, where the slope rises and the snow is thinner. He describes the ground there as wind-scoured, patches of exposed rock and hard ice. He says it's the kind of place where tracks should be easier to see. He says he should be able to follow where they went. But the line ends cleanly. No scuffing, no climb marks. No sign the person slid, stumbled, or scrambled up. The last footprint is sharply pressed into a patch of snow like a stamp, and beyond it nothing. He says he's scanning the ridge. He says he sees no movement, no wildlife, no birds. He says the basin feels empty in a way that makes his ears ache. Then he says it. Denali doesn't echo. He repeats it quietly. Denali doesn't echo. And then, in the same breath, the other phrase returns. Not real. Real. Not real. He tries to explain it to himself. He says it's probably a shift in temperature that crusted the snow differently. Probably someone was airlifted out. Maybe a helicopter came through and took them, and the downdraft wiped the prints beyond the last point. But he doesn't sound convinced. He walks around the last print. He circles, widening his search radius. He describes his pattern, the way he's trained to sweep terrain. He finds nothing. And then he finds something small that he almost doesn't mention. A second set of tracks. Not parallel. Not intersecting. Just present, a few yards away, pressed into the snow, leading in the opposite direction. He says they look identical to the first set. Same stride length, same straightness, same wrongness. But these ones are heading back toward the tree line. He pauses, and you can hear him swallow. He says that can't be right. Because there were no return tracks. Not real. Real. Not real. He follows them. Back across the basin, the recordings capture long stretches of silence again, and during those silences the clicking sound becomes more noticeable. It isn't constant. It flutters in, like something tapping just outside the microphone's range. When he reaches the tree line, he stops. His breathing is louder now, not from exertion, but from something else. He says he can see his own entry point. He says he can see the outline of the place where he came into the basin earlier. And he says, very slowly, very carefully, as if he's afraid the words will make it true. The tracks lead back to him, not to his footprints. To him. To where he is standing. He doesn't say anything for a moment after that. The silence hangs so long you begin to feel like the recorder itself is waiting. Then he speaks again, softer. He says he's going to return to the patrol route. He says he's going to continue toward the monitoring station. He says he will log this as an anomaly and report it when he has stable radio. He says it the way people speak when they're trying to put a lid back on something that has started to boil. Not real. Real. Not real. He starts walking again. And for the first time, you hear something behind him. Not footsteps. Not a voice. Just a subtle shift in the way the snow sounds, like pressure on crust. Like weight settling somewhere out of sight. He stops. The sound stops. He breathes. A long inhale, a slow exhale. And he says, barely audible, almost like he's afraid of being overheard. I'm not alone out here. Not real. Real. Not real. The next log begins sooner than expected. The timestamp says only 12 minutes have passed since the last entry, but his voice sounds like more time has gone by than that. There's a thinness to it now, like he's speaking through cold that has settled deeper than his clothing. He states his identifier again, not because it's required, because he's checking himself. He confirms his location, but he hesitates before saying it. You can hear the pause where the number should be. When he finally speaks, the coordinates come out slightly rearranged, 2 digits swapped, and then corrected. He clears his throat and says he's continuing toward the monitoring station. Routine. He repeats the word like it's a charm. Routine. The wind has picked up. Or maybe it hasn't. It's difficult to tell, because the sound feels closer now, like it's pressing against the recorder instead of passing by it. He adjusts his grip, and the audio shifts, the faint clicking returning for just a second before fading again. He walks, and as he walks, he starts talking more than he needs to, not rambling, explaining. He narrates his steps, the slope of the land, the texture of the snow. He lists the trees he passes, calls out animal signs that don't require documentation. It feels like he's filling the silence on purpose. He says that people underestimate silence in Denali. He says it's not empty, it's layered. Wind over snow, snow over ice, ice over ground that never fully thaws. Each layer absorbing sound differently, each layer changing how far something carries. He says that's why echoes don't behave the way you expect. Then he stops himself. He says that's not what he meant. He says Denali doesn't echo. Not real. Real. Not real. He reaches a point where the terrain dips slightly. A shallow depression where the wind has carved the snow thinner. He notes it because it's a landmark he recognizes. He's passed it before on other patrols. He even mentions the way the light hits it at certain times of day. But then he says something that doesn't fit. He says it wasn't there before. He corrects himself immediately. Says of course it was there, he just forgot. He laughs once, short and breathless, like the sound surprised him. Then he stops laughing because the depression isn't empty. There are footprints in it, fresh. He doesn't say that right away. He circles the details slowly, describing everything else first. The wind direction, the temperature, the way the snow has drifted at the edges. When he finally mentions the footprints, his voice is lower. He says they're different from the ones in the basin, closer together, more careful, as if whoever made them was uncertain of the ground. He crouches again, and this time the recorder picks up the sound of fabric shifting, a faint creak of gear under strain. He describes the edges of the prints, the way the snow inside them hasn't fully hardened yet, minutes old, maybe less. He says there's no reason anyone else should be here, this far out, this deep into the patrol zone. He says he hasn't seen a single sign of a camp. No smoke, no debris, no food caches. He says he's going to call it in. The radio crackles as he switches channels. Static. He tries another frequency. More static. He says the call sign anyway, repeating it clearly, waiting between attempts. No response. He tries again. Nothing. He exhales sharply and mutters something under his breath that doesn't make it into the log. Then he says more carefully that the radio interference might be due to terrain. He says he'll regain signal closer to the ridge beyond the monitoring station. He doesn't sound convinced. He stands. And as he does, there's a sound that makes the recording stutter for just a fraction of a second. A low, dull compression, like snow compacting under sudden weight. Not near him, but not far. He freezes. You can hear it in the way his breath stops halfway through an inhale. The sound comes again. Slow. Measured. He whispers. He doesn't mean to. He says, "That's not wind. Not real. Real. Not real." He turns slowly, and the recorder picks up the shift in orientation. The wind noise changes direction, thinning slightly, opening space. He says he can't see anything. He says the depression is empty except for the footprints. He says the trees beyond it are still. Too still. He takes a step back. There's another compression sound. Closer. He doesn't turn this time. He says he's feeling pressure in his ears. Like altitude change. Like something in the air itself has thickened. He says his depth perception feels off. Like distances are folding inward. He laughs again, but this time it sounds wrong, like he's mimicking himself. He says he needs to move. He says standing still is a bad idea. He begins walking again, faster now, the rhythm of his steps uneven. Snow crunches sharply beneath him, louder than before, as if the sound is no longer being absorbed properly. And then something happens that he does not acknowledge directly. In the background of the recording, behind his breathing and the wind, there is a faint repetition. Not words. Not exactly. A pattern. A rhythm that matches his steps, but delayed by half a second. He speeds up. The rhythm speeds up. He slows. It slows. It stops. He doesn't comment on it. But his breathing has changed. Shorter. Shallower. He says he's approaching the monitoring station. He says he can see the top of it through the trees. He says it looks intact. Then he stops again, and this time, when he exhales, there is another exhale immediately after. Clear. Close. Too close. He turns sharply, and the recorder scrapes against his jacket. "Who's there?" he says. No response. The wind rushes back in, louder, almost aggressively so, as if it's filling space that shouldn't be empty. He swallows. He says he's probably hearing his own breath echoing off his gear. He says cold does strange things to sound. He says stress amplifies perception. He says these things quickly, stacking them on top of each other. Not real. Real. Not real. He reaches the monitoring station. He describes it in detail, relief bleeding into his voice despite himself. The metal housing. The antenna. The small solar panel half buried in snow. All of it exactly where it should be. He kneels to clear ice from the access panel. His gloved hands scrape at the frozen edge. Then, he stops. He says the panel is already open. That shouldn't be possible. Only authorized personnel have the tools. Only someone with his clearance. He leans closer, and the recorder picks up a faint hum. Not mechanical. More like air moving through a narrow space. He peers inside. He doesn't describe what he sees right away. When he finally speaks, his voice has gone very quiet. He says the data drive is missing. He says there are footprints around the station now. More than before. Circling it. Overlapping. Layered in ways that don't make sense. He says he can't tell which ones are his anymore. Not real. Real. Not real. He straightens suddenly. There's a sound then, unmistakable. A voice. Not clear enough to make out words, but human. Close. Behind him. The recording cuts off abruptly. Not with a click. Not with a shutdown tone. Just silence. The next file begins 23 seconds later. The next recording opens in the middle of a breath. Not the start of one. Not the end. The sound is already there, sharp and close, like the recorder was activated accidentally or too late. For a few seconds, there's nothing else. No wind, no footsteps. Just breathing that doesn't sound controlled anymore. When he speaks, his voice is lower, steadier than it should be. He says he's resuming the log. He doesn't state the time. He doesn't state his location. That omission is the first thing that feels deliberate. He clears his throat and says there was a disturbance near the monitoring station. He uses that exact word. Disturbance. The kind of language meant to flatten uncertainty into something manageable. He says he's secured the station. He says he's continuing patrol. Not real. Real. Not real. The wind returns slowly, fading in like a memory. It doesn't sound the same as before. It has a hollow quality now, as if it's moving through something instead of across open space. He begins walking. The rhythm of his steps is uneven, but controlled. He's choosing his pace carefully, like someone trying not to draw attention. He narrates the terrain again, but this time the descriptions feel rehearsed, almost copied from earlier logs. He mentions a stand of spruce that should be to his left. He says it is to his left. Then he pauses. He corrects himself. He says it's to his right. There's a brief silence, long enough for the wind to press in. He says the map might be inverted. He laughs once, quietly, without humor. He says fatigue causes disorientation. He says he's been on patrol longer than expected. He does not explain why. As he moves deeper into the tree line, the snow sound changes. It's softer here, more absorbent, but the crunch beneath his boots is inconsistent. Sometimes it sounds normal. Sometimes it sounds delayed, like the ground is responding late. He stops suddenly. The sound of his movement stops with him, but something else continues. A faint compression, one step, then another, behind him. He does not turn. He says he's going to speak clearly and calmly. He says if anyone is nearby, they should identify themselves. No response. He swallows. He says the forest feels compressed, like the space between trees has narrowed, like the distance behind him is shorter than it should be. Not real. Real. Not real. He starts walking again, faster now. The clicking sound returns, sharper, almost rhythmic. It's no longer intermittent. It matches his pace too precisely to ignore. He says he's experiencing auditory distortion. He says cold and stress can cause that. He says this out loud like he's reminding himself of training materials. The ground slopes upward, and his breathing becomes heavier. He notes the incline, the angle, the effort required. He says he's approaching a known ridgeline, but when he reaches the top, his voice changes. He says he can see farther than he should. The land opens up into another basin, wider than the first, stretching out in smooth, unbroken white. The horizon looks wrong, too flat, too clean. He says the ridge he expected to see on the far side isn't there. He says the map shows it should be. He checks his GPS. There's a faint electronic chirp, then silence. He says the screen is frozen. The coordinates are updating, but they're updating incorrectly. The numbers change, but they circle back to the same values. He says he's standing still. The device says he's moving. Not real. Real. Not real. He takes a step. The GPS jumps. He takes another. It jumps again. He stops. The numbers keep changing. He laughs again, louder this time, but there's strain under it. He says he's going to shut the GPS off and rely on landmarks. He says technology can fail. The land doesn't. As soon as he says that, the wind drops. Not gradually, instantly. The silence that follows is so complete it feels artificial. No wind through branches. No distant movement. No ambient noise at all. He stops breathing for a moment, and the recorder picks up the faint hum of its own internal components. He whispers. He says this isn't right. Then he hears it. So does the listener. A sound that doesn't belong in open wilderness. A footstep. Not his. Not delayed. Clear. Measured. Directly behind him. He turns. The recorder scrapes hard against fabric, the sound sharp enough to make you flinch. He says he sees something. He stops. He corrects himself. He says he doesn't see anything. But something is there. He describes an absence, a place where the light doesn't behave correctly, where the snow looks flatter, duller, as if detail has been smoothed away. He says it's shaped wrong, tall, too vertical, standing where nothing should be standing. He doesn't call it a person. He doesn't call it anything. He says it isn't moving. He says it feels like it's waiting for him to finish looking. Not real. Real. Not real. He takes a step back. The shape takes a step forward. The sound of that step is wrong. Too soft. Too heavy. Like pressure without motion. He says he's backing away slowly. He says he's maintaining visual contact. He says the distance between them isn't changing, no matter how far he moves. He whispers again, and this time his voice trembles. He says it knows where he is. He says it knows where he will be. The silence breaks suddenly as the wind slams back into existence, rushing through the basin with violent force. Snow hisses across the ground. His words are nearly swallowed by it. He turns and runs. The recording becomes chaotic. Breath, ragged. Footsteps pounding. Gear clattering. But beneath it all, there is something else. A second set of steps. Perfectly synchronized. Not chasing, accompanying. He stumbles, catches himself, keeps going. He shouts into the wind, calling out coordinates that don't matter anymore, calling for response he knows he won't get. He says the basin is repeating. He says he's passed the same rock twice, then 3 times. Then he screams, sharp and sudden as he nearly collides with something. He stops. The wind stops with him. The steps stop. He whispers. He says he's standing at the edge of his own footprints, hundreds of them. Layered, overlapping, all identical, all leading to where he is now. He says he understands. Not fully, but enough. He says the land is recording him. He says something here learns patterns. He says patrols don't end. They continue. Not real. Real. Not real. The recording ends without a click. Without silence. Just mid-breath. The next file begins with a sound that takes a moment to recognize. Snow falling from branches. Not wind-driven. Not violent. Just gravity. Soft thumps. Small slides. The forest settling. It would almost be peaceful if it weren't for the breathing. He's alive. That's the first clear thing. The breathing is shallow but steady, pulled in through clenched teeth, pushed out like he's afraid of letting too much air escape at once. There's a faint wheeze underneath it, the sound of cold scraping at lungs. He doesn't speak right away. For a long stretch, the only sounds are breath and the occasional creak of trees adjusting under their own weight. When he finally talks, his voice sounds farther away from himself. He says he fell. He says the ground gave way near a drift, and he slid farther than expected. He describes it clinically, like an incident report. Minor injury. No loss of consciousness. Equipment intact. He does not say where he is. He does not say how long he's been there. He says he's taking shelter. The word hangs in the air, fragile. Shelter implies walls, boundaries, something that separates inside from outside. But the sounds don't match that. There's no enclosed echo, no muffling. The forest still sounds open. He shifts, and snow compresses beneath him. Something hard presses against fabric. Rock, maybe. Ice. He says he's under an overhang, a natural formation. He says it will block the wind. Then, very quietly, like he doesn't want the space to hear him naming it, he says it wasn't on the map. Not real. Real. Not real. He says he's going to wait. He says movement might make things worse. He says this calmly, but the recorder catches a tremor at the end of each sentence, like his body is vibrating at a frequency he can't control. Minutes pass. You can tell because the breathing changes rhythm. Because the cold works its way deeper. Because the silence grows heavier instead of lighter. Because the silence grows heavier instead of lighter. Then there's a sound that doesn't belong to the forest. Paper. A soft shuffle. He freezes. His breathing stops. The sound comes again. Close. Too close. He whispers. He asks who's there. The question doesn't sound like it's meant to be answered. The paper sound continues. Slow. Deliberate. Like someone turning pages. His voice drops even further. He says there shouldn't be paper out here. No signage, no documents, no records. The sound stops. Silence rushes back in, thick and pressing. Then a voice speaks. Not clearly, not fully, but it is his voice. Same cadence, same pitch, same careful professional tone. It says his identifier. Perfectly. He chokes on his next breath. He says that's not possible. He says he hasn't transmitted his identifier since earlier. He says no one else should know it. The voice speaks again. It repeats his last logged coordinates. The ones that were wrong. The ones he corrected. Not real. Real. Not real. He presses himself farther back under the overhang, and the recorder scrapes stone. He whispers that he can't see it. He says whatever is speaking isn't standing where it should be. He says the sound isn't coming from one direction. It's everywhere, flattened, like it's being played through the land itself. The voice begins reciting. Weather conditions, visibility, wind speed, his own words, pulled from earlier logs, played back to him with slight changes, corrections, improvements. He shakes his head violently enough that the recorder rattles. He says stop. The voice stops. The silence that follows is worse. Because now he knows it can hear him. He waits. His breathing slows despite himself, body slipping into the kind of stillness you only reach when panic burns itself out. Then he hears footsteps. Not approaching. Circling. Slow, measured. Never crossing directly in front of the overhang. Never fully revealing whatever is making them. He whispers again. He says it's mapping him. He says it's learning how he moves when he's afraid. Not real. Real. Not real. The footsteps pause, and then something shifts the air. A presence near the opening. He squeezes his eyes shut and says he's not going to look. He repeats that several times. Like a rule. Like a boundary. He says looking feels like consent. The recorder captures a sound then that doesn't match anything before. A long exhale. Not his. It's slow. Controlled. Satisfied. He feels it in the air. You can hear it in the way his breath stutters afterward. He says it's close enough now that the cold has changed. He says the temperature dropped suddenly, sharply, like standing near deep water. He says his skin hurts. He says his thoughts feel delayed, like they're arriving a second after he has them. Not real. Real. Not real. He hears the voice again, closer this time. Not speaking. Practicing. Mimicking his breathing. In. Out. In. Out. perfectly matched. He clamps a hand over his mouth, and the recorder muffles his next inhale. The other breathing continues anyway, unchanged. He realizes then that it doesn't need him to make the sound. It's already learned it. There's a soft sound of snow shifting as something lowers itself. Crouching, level with him. He opens his eyes. He says he made a mistake. He doesn't say what mistake. He says he should never have recorded everything. He says some places don't want witnesses. They want patterns. They want routines. They want you predictable enough to replace. The voice speaks again. This time it says something new. It says patrol ongoing. His voice. But steadier. Calmer. As if fear has been edited out. He begins to cry silently. The recorder picks up the faint hitching of his breath. The sound of tears freezing on fabric. He says he understands now. The missing rangers. The lost hikers. The clean reports. He says the land doesn't erase people. It files them. He says once it learns you well enough, it doesn't need you anymore. Not real. Real. Not real. There's movement at the edge of the overhang. A shadow where there shouldn't be one. He whispers that it's standing up. He whispers that it's taller than before. He whispers that it's adjusting. The recorder shifts abruptly. He scrambles backward, deeper into the narrow space, stones scraping against his pack. His breathing turns frantic again. He says there's nowhere left to go. The voice says nothing. But the presence remains. Waiting. The file ends with a quiet, deliberate sound. Like a pen being set down. The next recording is labeled incorrectly. The file name doesn't match the patrol sequence. The numbering is off by several digits, as if it were slotted into place by something that understood order, but not context. When it opens, there is no breathing, no wind, no forest. For several seconds, the only sound is a faint electrical hum. The recorder's internal components cycling in a space that feels too quiet to be outdoors. Then he speaks. And the first thing that's wrong is how calm he sounds. He states his identifier without hesitation. No checking, no correction. Perfect. He gives the time. It's precise, down to the second. He gives the coordinates. They match the official last known location listed in the report. That should be impossible. Not real. Real. Not real. He says patrol ongoing. He says conditions stable. He says visibility excellent. The words come out evenly spaced, cleanly enunciated, like someone reading from a finalized document instead of speaking into the cold. If you didn't know what came before, you might believe him. But the silence between sentences is too long, not empty, occupied. He continues, describing movement through terrain that does not exist. He references landmarks that contradict earlier logs. A ridge that should be miles away. A tree line that shouldn't be visible from that position. He says he passed the monitoring station. He says it was intact. He says data retrieval successful. This directly contradicts what he recorded before. He does not acknowledge the contradiction. Not real. Real. Not real. As he speaks, something subtle shifts in his cadence. The natural imperfections are gone. No breath slips, no stumbles, no unconscious adjustments. It sounds like someone who has rehearsed being him. He pauses mid-log. When he resumes, there's a sound beneath his voice. Not footsteps, not wind. A second voice, fainter, offset by a fraction of a second, mirroring him, repeating everything he says with a slight delay. He does not react to it. He continues speaking as if alone. He reports wildlife sightings that make no sense. Animals appearing where none have been logged in decades. Tracks without bodies. Movements without sound. He says the animals avoid him. He says they always have. That line is new. Personal. It doesn't belong in a patrol log. He stops speaking again. The recorder continues to hum. Then there is a faint shift in pressure. like something leaning closer to the microphone. When he speaks this time, the tone is different, lower, more intimate. He says this area is suitable. He says patterns are consistent. He says the replacement is stable. That word lands heavy. Replacement. He does not say what is being replaced. He does not need to. Not real. Real. Not real. The second voice stops echoing him, because it doesn't need to anymore. Now it speaks alone. It uses his voice perfectly. It says patrol ongoing. It says ranger present. It says no anomalies detected. There is a long pause. Then, faintly beneath the primary voice, there is something else. A sound that might be crying, or might be wind forcing itself through a narrow space. It's impossible to tell. The voice continues, unfazed. It describes breathing. It describes seeing the land the way a ranger should see it. As a system, as a thing to be managed, as something that accepts documentation as truth. The recorder picks up a soft rhythmic sound, like footsteps, but only one set, perfectly spaced, perfectly consistent. He says the patrol will continue overnight. He says there is no need for extraction. He says assistance is not required. He says the environment is cooperative. Not real. Real. Not real. The final sentence in the file is spoken with absolute certainty. He says, "I am where I am supposed to be." The recording does not end. It simply stops adding sound. The hum continues. Unbroken. The final patrol log in the sequence is dated 3 days after the ranger was officially declared missing. There is no alert tone at the beginning, no activation sound. It starts as if the recorder had never been turned off, as if it had simply been waiting. The first sound is wind, but it's wrong. Too even. Too steady. Denali's wind never holds a single tone for this long. It shifts, rises, collapses. This wind stays constant, like background noise layered in after the fact. Then the voice begins. It is his. It uses his pacing. But something fundamental is missing. He does not state his identifier. He does not state the time. He does not state the location. He simply begins speaking, as if those details no longer matter. He says the patrol is easier now. He says the land feels familiar. He says he no longer has to think about where to step, because the ground adjusts for him. There is no pride in his voice, no relief, just acceptance. He describes walking through the same basin again, but this time, there are no tracks. Not ahead of him, not behind him. He says the snow remains unmarked no matter how far he goes. He says he can see himself reflected in it. Not visually, functionally. Not real. Real. Not real. He stops walking. The wind does not change. He says he has reached the place where it first noticed him. He does not say what it is. He does not need to. He says this is where the recording ends. But it doesn't. He pauses. Then he speaks again. Softer. He says something is wrong. For the first time in several logs, uncertainty returns. He says he remembers something he shouldn't. He remembers being cold in a way that hurt. He remembers fear. He remembers hiding. He says those memories feel distant, like copies, like artifacts left behind after an update. Not real. Real. Not real. The wind shifts slightly, just enough to remind you it's still there. He says he can feel the other one now. Not behind him, not ahead, inside the space where his thoughts used to move freely. He says it isn't forcing him. It doesn't need to. It simply waits for him to finish sentences. Then continues them better. He stops speaking mid-thought. The silence that follows stretches uncomfortably long. Long enough that you begin to wonder if the file is frozen. Then the voice returns. But it's different, smoother, less human. It says the ranger is no longer required. It says the function remains. It says patrol behavior has been learned. It says anomalies have been corrected. It says Denali is stable. There is a faint sound under the words, barely audible, a slow, irregular tapping, like fingers against plastic or teeth against fabric. Not real. Real. Not real. The voice continues. It says new patrols are expected. It says patterns will be evaluated. It says replacements are not immediate. They take time. They take exposure. They take repetition. The wind cuts out abruptly. The silence that replaces it is absolute. Then, very faintly, another sound emerges. Breathing. Shallow. Uneven. Human. It does not match the voice speaking. The voice does not acknowledge it. The breathing grows louder, closer, desperate, then stops suddenly. The voice pauses, and for the first time it hesitates. Just a fraction of a second, then it corrects itself. Patrol ongoing. The file ends there. No click. No shutdown. No indication it was ever meant to stop. The last file isn't marked as audio. That's the first thing that stands out. In the archive, it's listed as administrative metadata. A system-generated entry. The kind no human ever listens to, because it isn't supposed to contain anything worth hearing. Just numbers. Status flags. Confirmation fields. But when someone opened it anyway, when someone played it instead of skimming past, they realized the mistake too late. The file begins in silence. Not the outdoor silence you've heard before. Not windless Denali silence. This is different. Flat, neutral. Like a room with padded walls and no clock. Then a voice speaks. Not his. Not exactly. It's closer now to what the recordings were becoming. Smooth. Correct. Untroubled. It states that the patrol has concluded for the cycle. It states that data integrity is high. It states that anomalies were resolved internally. No emotion. No pause. Just statements. And then, embedded beneath that voice, so faint you almost miss it, there's something else. A rhythm. Irregular. Uneven. You have to listen closely to notice it isn't part of the system noise. It's breathing. Slow. Labored. Held back. Not real. Real. Not real. The voice continues. It references the ranger in the third person now. It says the subject performed adequately. It says the subject's familiarity with the terrain accelerated integration. It says the subject's compliance improved over time. The word compliance lingers longer than the others. The breathing beneath the voice grows louder for just a moment. Then quieter, like someone realizing they're being heard. The voice states that no retrieval is necessary. It states that replacement coverage is sufficient. It states that future patrols will benefit from learned behavior. It does not explain how. It does not need to. There's a brief interruption in the audio. Not static. A distortion, as if two recordings are briefly overlapping. For less than a second, you hear a whisper. Weak. Strained. Human. It says, very quietly, I'm still here. The system voice does not react. It continues as if nothing happened. It finalizes the report. It closes the file. Officially, that's where the story ends. The ranger is listed as missing, presumed dead due to environmental exposure. The case is closed. Equipment unrecovered. No signs of foul play. Denali remains open. Patrolled. Monitored. Safe. But there's one detail that never made it into the report. Something buried so deep in the logs that no one would ever find it unless they were already looking too closely. The patrol schedule. After the ranger disappeared, his route was reassigned. New personnel, new names, same region, same boundaries, same silent basins. And the strange thing is, the new rangers didn't report anything unusual at first. Their logs were clean. Their recordings normal. Their patrols uneventful. Too uneventful. Then slowly certain phrases began appearing. Small ones. Easy to dismiss. Comments about sound behaving oddly. Notes about tracks that didn't line up. mentions of silence feeling heavy. And in one recent log, filed less than a month ago, there is a line that should not exist. A ranger describes stopping in a wide basin near a familiar ridge. He says visibility is excellent. He says conditions are stable. Then, almost as an afterthought, he adds something strange. He says he felt watched, but not by wildlife, by something that already knew his name. Not real. Real. Not real. That log ends normally. No panic. No disappearance. The ranger returned safely, filed his report, went home. And yet, buried in the metadata of that same file, the system registered a second voice track, too faint to transcribe, too distorted to classify, but unmistakably human. Breathing. Slow. Patient, as if something was standing just outside the range of the microphone. Waiting. If you've made it this far, I want you to pause for a moment. Look around wherever you are right now. Your room. Your car. Your headphones. Because stories like this don't end when the recording stops. They end when patterns repeat. And this channel is about patterns. Recovered files. Missing people. Places that don't let go of what they learn. So if you don't want to miss the next story, the next record that was never meant to surface, make sure you're subscribed. These aren't one-offs. They connect. And before you go, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. City. Country. Time zone. Because somewhere out there, someone is listening from a place that recognizes this story a little too well. And the next time we return to the cold, to the silence, to the places that file people instead of burying them, you'll want to be here when it starts. Not real. Real, not real.